Last time we were saying that we were going to see some conservative reaction to all of this liberalism. And for that, in the history books, we need to turn to the Lutheran confessionalists. You can put that in quotes, as they were called by their opponents, the liberals. But the names of some of these I've got up here behind me. E.W. Hengstenberg, that's a long name, but he was one of the great scholars of that Lutheran period. You would also perhaps notice Kyle, and you'd also notice Delitzsch in the commentary series that's still available at Christian Books, Christian Book Club, and others where you have the Kyle and Delitzsch Old Testament commentaries. And I would add to that Ehler, O-E-H-L-E-R, who was a considerable Old Testament theologian for that time. These men kept the higher critics at bay, defensively throughout most of the 19th century. Many of the works of these conservative scholars were translated into English. As I've intimated, Hengstenberg, in his Christology of the Old Testament, 4 volumes no less, as well as Kyle and Delitzsch, their biblical commentary on the Old Testament, which in my case is, I've forgotten how many volumes it is now, but it has been boiled down into less volumes, but it's still in print, as is Hengstenberg, in the United States. It is unfortunate, but conservative Old Testament scholarship has not been the same since the passing of these men. I really kind of feel that. Leaving aside a number of influential conservatives, and I'd make a long list here, but I'll let you read it over and over on the tape or something. William Henry Green, a very, very good scholar, and Robert Dick Wilson, equally so, of Princeton at the turn of the century. They were still very conservative back in that time. And in more recent decades, Merrill F. Unger, Charles L. Feinberg, Edward J. Young, Meredith Kline, Bruce Walke, Gleason Archer, J. Barton Payne, William Sanford Lasore, David A. Hubbard, Frederick W. Bush, and Ronald Youngblood. And besides that, add your own heroes. I could come up with a whole lot more, and I've been very generous there. I don't agree thoroughly with every one of those men, but I wouldn't expect to. A number of them were on the NIV when I was a translator for the NIV, and many of these men I knew personally. I could kind of make it's not a joke, but your pedigree, that is to say, you're here in my class listening to me, would go like this. Hengstenberg, Franz Delitzsch, his son Friedrich Delitzsch, who was a bit off the mark, more of a different type, Paul Haupt, H-A-U-P-T, William F. Albright, Charles Lee Feinberg, me, and then you. So thinking in terms of what school of thought am I from? I'm from that. And of course it's not just, one line, it's many things together, but that would kind of characterize it. I'm proud of these men that have gone before. I'm proud of those that I've had opportunity to teach or stand on my shoulders. And some people are already standing on their shoulders, of course. And the march goes on to preach the Word, to defend the Word, and to continue in meaningful scholarship. Well, now we can talk a few arguments against the documentary hypothesis. Wellhausen was wrong on several points, particularly the history of culture. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the history of religion, in his case, the history of literature, the consideration we have about the divine names, and that will take us along through part of this section. Realize that if you're living in up to 1918, a lot of things have happened since then. So in a way, I can't blame him for being short-sighted or ignorant about certain things. But meanwhile, he was very adamant that he was on the right track. In the history of culture, Wellhausen and his followers thought that they were dealing with a very ancient people in Israel. You see, we've pushed, as I said before, we pushed the boundary of our ignorance back for many more centuries than Wellhausen knew about even. Same thing happened with Darwin in evolution. He couldn't see any further than the end of his nose because we see down into the protons and neutrons and all of that now today, much more. Genesis 1 is deceptively close to Genesis 12. There's an awful lot packed into the text there, and you're not given, a notation as to the time involved. Their knowledge of Israel's historical milieu or context was very limited. To them, Greece of 500, 600 BC was shrouded in dark obscurity. I make this point often, I know. Today we have pushed the frontiers of our understanding of ancient history back to 3200. That's what I was saying at one point. I'd say now 3500 or so. Ancient history, referring to history in terms of writing. The invention of writing is back in that period, 35 or so. And we can speak confidently, really, about 10,000 BC in our discussions in the ancient Near East. Now, 10,000 BC, even for a young earther, you see, would be within their realm generally. Also, in the history of religion as a topic, to them, religion was evolutionary as well. The evolutionary idea of natural selection and improvement and so forth was very much a thing that they applied everywhere. And you can see it. It's just so easy to see it. It must have had, the history of religion must have had a primitive beginning and must evolve from animism, A-N-I-mism, totemism, the totem pole you think of, to fetishism, you can look these up, ancestor worship, mountain worship, polydemonism, polytheism, and finally monotheism. Isn't that absurd? That they have to say, well, this is how life goes, so they apply that model to even biblical studies and history of religion. There's no compelling evidence for saying that these forms of religion evolved. We have animists in the world today. I know some among the Bedouin of Jordan. By that I mean the person that might get down at the end, plant their crop and get down at the end of the road and pray to the grain god that their crop might come in and be successful. So if that's evolution, I don't know, something's funny. It's definitely not, doesn't work with religion. In the history of literature, Wellhausen assumed that by literary sifting, scholars could come up with literary sources. That's an assumption, that you could tell who the sources were by this kind of thing. Anyone can do that with anything written. Try it out with Goldilocks and the Three Bears. A much neglected criterion for judging literature is subject matter. I have yet to see something written satisfactorily from this standpoint. You could have the Goldilocks tradition, the Mama Bear tradition, the Papa Bear tradition, the Baby Bear tradition, and claim that these three literary sources or strands of information somehow are brought together to give you the entire story. And that's what makes it so preposterous. You can take it back to the simplest things and say, it's all one story. The story about Papa Bear never existed completely, independently from the rest. Oh my. And once again, I want to touch on the idea of the use of divine names. Subject matter, which is lost on everybody. If I wanted to write something big and large about the Bible and understanding it, it's subject matter. And that is so pervasive. I think we shall come up across that again. Among the Hebrews, the divine names are not used helter-skelter. They're used purposefully. Nothing they did was this way. The Jews were very, very precise in all of the things that they did about religion and so forth, because after all, they were being taught, and what they came up with was the efforts of a schoolmaster to lead them to Christ. A much neglected criterion for judging literature, then we say, is subject matter, and that's something that we should pay close attention to. Among the Jews, the divine names are not used helter-skelter, we said. Nothing they did was that way. In the legal literature, in the Pentateuch and Ezekiel, where the prophet focuses on the laws, only Yahweh occurs as the personal name of God. In the prophetic writings, Elohim is never used as a proper noun in place of Yahweh. That would be important. The prophets use Yahweh. An exception is Jonah. But Jonah, though among the prophets in the Hebrew canon, is in fact a narrative piece about the Assyrians, really, in Nineveh. The latter part of Isaiah often uses El, E-L, even short, for Elohim. In the poetic writings, excluding wisdom portions, only Yahweh is used. In the wisdom literature, in the poetic portion of Job, Yahweh occurs only once. Instead, El, Eloah, E-L-O-A-H, Elohim, and Shaddai, God Almighty, are employed. This variation must be due to the fact of subject matter, the fact that wisdom literature is a universal type of writing. The Babylonian wisdom literature is contemporaneous, and we'll see how that works out in our next section.